In 1845, 3 black sisters were born into slavery on a Mississippi plantation. They were identical triplets, and from the moment they arrived, the masters could not control them. The girls never cried, never broke under the whip. Instead, they sang, and their voices carried through the night, rattling windows and filling every corner of the plantation. Then, one night, they vanished. The cellar was empty, the journals unfinished, and the only words left behind were these. They walked out together, humming as the flames followed. Some stories were meant to be erased, but whispers survive. Tonight, we unearth one of them, the unholy case of the Plantation Triplets the masters could not control. If stories like this reach you, subscribe to the Macabre Record and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. In 1845, in the state of Mississippi, a case unfolded that was never meant to be spoken of again. It was whispered in corners, scratched into margins, passed down in hushed tones that carried more fear than memory. The story of 3 sisters, born together in bondage, who seemed to resist not only their chains, but the very men who owned them. They were called triplets, though no ledger ever named them. They were said to move as one, breathe as one, and hum a sound that unsettled all who heard it. And when they disappeared, their absence was so profound, so unexplainable, that the masters themselves tried to erase the evidence with fire and silence. But fragments remain, and in those fragments is a truth too haunting to ignore. The triplets came into this world beneath a shroud of thunder. Their mother, herself enslaved, labored in a cramped wooden cabin that smelled of rain-soaked earth and blood. By the time the cries had died down, 3 daughters lay swaddled in rags, identical faces glistening with the sweat of survival. They should have been celebrated as a miracle, but miracles were not allowed in chains. To the overseers, they were a warning. To the master, they were an opportunity. To their mother, they were everything. And yet they were taken from her arms before the blood had even dried. They were carried not to the fields where other children played and worked, but to the cellar beneath the Hollow Creek plantation house. It was said the master believed they were born for something more than labor. He wanted to know why they had come together, why 3 had emerged where nature should have given one. And so, they were locked away, their lives reduced to study, their voices reduced to notes in a physician's ledger. But the cellar did not contain them. At night, their humming rose through the floorboards, carried into the bedrooms of those who pretended not to hear. The sound unsettled the household, yet comforted the enslaved who slept in the quarters. Some claimed the sisters sang a hymn of freedom, others believed it was a warning. And as the years passed, the sound grew stronger, until one night, it stopped. The cellar was found empty, the journals unfinished, and the last words anyone dared record were these. They walked out together, humming as the flames followed. The story begins with a woman whose name was never written, though her body carried the weight of countless histories. She was enslaved, forced to work until her belly grew too heavy for the fields, and when her time came she was given no midwife, no comfort, only a corner of a wooden cabin, and the knowledge that pain was hers alone. It was in that corner, on a storm-lit night in the spring of 1845, that she brought forth not one child, but 3. 3 daughters. 3 identical cries that split the silence of Hollow Creek Plantation. Her arms wrapped around them with trembling urgency, as if she knew the moment would be fleeting. In whispers, she gave them names no one else would ever acknowledge. Sarah, Selah, Serenity. Names like prayers, carried on her breath, pressed into their ears before the overseer's boots thundered at the door. She knew she had only moments, and in those moments she poured into them everything she could not give in freedom. Her love, her protection, her desperate hope. But there was no miracle in bondage, The overseers looked upon the three girls with suspicion. They called them unnatural, cursed, a sign of bad harvests or worse. The master, however, looked upon them with a different hunger. Identical children were rare, he knew, rarer still among the enslaved. To him, they were not daughters, not sisters, not human at all. They were specimens, curiosities to be studied, controlled, and perhaps even sold for profit. Before the mother's sweat had dried, before her arms could memorize the weight of their small bodies, the triplets were taken. Her cries filled the cabin, but cries were of no consequence. She was silenced with threats, silenced with the lash, silenced with the cruel reminder that what came from her body did not belong to her. The girls, swaddled in rough cloth, were carried toward the looming house that ruled over all. They did not enter through the grand doors or the polished halls. They were taken beneath it, to the cellar where stone walls sweated with damp and shadows never lifted. It was there they were placed, under lock and key, their lives marked not by lullabies or family, but by the scratch of pens and the cold gaze of men who believed science and ownership gave them power over all things. Yet from that cellar, in their first nights together, came a sound no whip could silence. 3 voices, soft and steady, humming in unison. The masters shifted uneasily in their beds. The enslaved paused in their prayers. And already, a story had begun that chains alone could not contain. From the very beginning, the Hollow Creek triplets were not spoken of in ordinary tones. Their existence itself was a whisper, carried in fear, wonder, and disbelief. Among the enslaved, their birth was seen as a sign, though what it meant depended on who was speaking. Some whispered that the 3 girls were a gift from God, born to break chains that no iron could hold. Others believed they were marked by spirits older than any Bible carried onto the plantation. Their mother, quiet and watchful, never argued with either view. She simply pressed her lips to their foreheads and called them by the names only she knew, refusing to let their humanity be swallowed by superstition. To the overseers, the sisters were something altogether different. They spoke of curses in the night, muttered of strange omens and the master's poor fortune. It was said that when the triplets were born, the hounds refused to hunt, whining at the edge of the woods as though they smelled something unnatural. The cotton crop that year withered in the field, struck by blight. Men with power and fear in equal measure looked at 3 small children and saw only a shadow over their profits. The master himself refused to call it a curse. He saw in the sisters not doom, but opportunity. Identical triplets were rare, he reminded the overseers, rarer still in bondage. In his eyes, they were a possession unlike any other, a living anomaly that might earn him reputation, money, perhaps even a place in the journals of respected men. And so he called for physicians, men who carried leather bags and ink-stained ledgers, to see what could be learned from 3 daughters born of one mother in chains. But what unsettled everyone most was not their likeness, nor their silence, but the sound they made together. Late at night, when the lanterns burned low, and the wind curled around the corners of the plantation house, their humming would rise from the cellar. It was not a melody taught by hand or voice. It was something older, something woven between them as naturally as breath. It slipped beneath doors, through cracks in the floor, out into the night air, where both master and slave could hear it. And when they did, even the boldest men grew restless. Children covered their ears. Mothers clutched their infants tighter. Overseers drank more than usual. The sound carried something unspoken, something unexplainable. And though no one would admit it aloud, the triplets were no longer simply children. They were an omen, and omens demand to be feared. Beneath the Hollow Creek plantation hoot, was a cellar few dared enter willingly. The air there was always damp, carrying the smell of earth, mold, and rot. The stone walls wept with condensation, streaked dark with years of neglect. Rats scurried in the corners, their claws scratching the silence, and lanterns gave off little more than a weak glow against the shadows that seemed to thicken rather than fade. This was where the triplets were taken, not to be raised among the other children, not to learn the rhythms of work in the fields, but to be contained, studied, and hidden. Their mother begged for them in whispers. She offered to nurse them, to care for them, to take on extra burdens if only she could be with her daughters. But her pleas fell on stone hearts. The master ordered them kept below, away from the others, away from the dangers of superstition spreading through the quarters. There, he said, they would be watched properly, their lives turned into knowledge that could be recorded and controlled. The cellar became their world. The triplets slept on beds of straw. Their small frames wrapped in ragged blankets meant more to keep the damp from their bones than to bring comfort. Their food came in wooden bowls, often cold, delivered without words. They learned to move in shadow, to play in silence, to find one another's hands in the dark when the lanterns burned out. They grew in isolation, yet never seemed afraid of it. Those who were forced to descend into the cellar returned with strange stories. A house servant confessed that when she left the bowls at the door, she would hear the sound of 3 voices behind it, not talking, not crying, but humming. The sound was steady, low, and unsettling, echoing strangely off the stone until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Some swore it made the air itself vibrate. Even the physicians who came to observe the sisters could not ignore it. They noted their identical appearances, the way they moved together, how their gazes seemed to fall on the same point, as if their minds were one. But what they wrote most about, in words heavy with unease, was the sound. They could not describe it adequately, only that it unsettled them, that it lingered in their ears long after they had climbed the cellar stairs. And so the cellar, once a forgotten space beneath the master's home, became a place no one wished to linger. The humming filled it night after night, until it seemed less like a prison and more like a vessel, one that held not 3 children, but something larger than any chain could bind. At first, the sound seemed harmless, a soft humming, like the kind a mother might make to soothe her child. But the Hollow Creek triplets had no mother's arms, no lullaby to follow. The notes they carried came from nowhere anyone could explain. 3 small girls locked in a cellar, producing tones so perfectly in harmony that it was impossible to believe they had not been taught. It was music without words, steady and low, and once it began, it did not stop. The enslaved who worked in the quarters said the sound drifted through the soil itself, slipping beneath floorboards and walls until it reached them at night. For some, it brought comfort, like a prayer wrapping around their sleep. For others, it stirred unease, a reminder that something in this world was not as it should be. A few whispered that the triplets were touched by spirits older than the chains that bound them, that their song was not meant for men's ears at all. The masters, however, felt something else entirely. When the humming reached their rooms, they could not rest. It clawed at the edges of their sleep, made their hearts beat fast in their chests. They sent men down to silence the children, but no matter how harsh the order, no matter how cruel the punishment, the sound continued. It was not loud, not defiant, but it was unyielding. That, more than anything, unsettled them. The physicians tried to rationalize it. They wrote in their journals of nervous mimicry, of shared instinct, of the peculiar ability of siblings to influence one another's behavior. Yet their words faltered as the nights wore on. Some began to hear the humming, even when they were far from the cellar. Others admitted in private that the sound followed them into their dreams, where it grew louder, filling halls and corridors that were empty when they woke. For the enslaved children, it was different still. They claimed that if you listened closely, the triplets' humming carried something beneath it. Not just sound, but meaning. Some swore they dreamed of places beyond the fields, rivers that led to freedom, faces they had never seen but somehow recognized. It was as though the sisters sang a map, one too dangerous to speak aloud. Whatever it was, the sound became impossible to ignore. It haunted the nights, lingered in the mornings, and etched itself into every mind at Hollow Creek. And though no one admitted it openly, one truth became clear. The masters could own their bodies, but they could not own the song. In time, the master of Hollow Creek grew restless. His overseers muttered about curses, his servants whispered about spirits, and still the triplets thrived in the shadows of his cellar. To him, they were more than children. They were a curiosity too rare to waste. And so he sent for physicians from the city, men who dressed in black coats and carried leather satchels filled with instruments gleaming with steel. These men prided themselves on science, on observation, on peeling back the mysteries of nature, as one might peel the skin from fruit. When they descended into the cellar, their pens scratched furiously against their ledgers. They measured the girls' heads with calipers, compared the symmetry of their limbs, noted the strange unity in their movements. They pried open their mouths, checked their eyes, listened to their small hearts beating in near-perfect rhythm. One wrote that it was as though the three shared a single pulse. Another described them as unnervingly identical in body and demeanor alike. But none of their measurements could account for the sound. The physicians arrived with the arrogance of reason, but by their second night, that arrogance began to tremble. They wrote of hearing the humming in the cellar, how it rose and fell with no obvious pattern, how it grew louder when they tried to separate the girls, how it filled the air like a vibration rather than a voice. They attempted to silence it, ordering the triplets to stop, even threatening them. Yet the humming persisted, low and steady, as if the sisters answered to no command but their own. Some of the Isicians began to lose sleep. They confessed in their private notes that the humming followed them back to their lodgings, echoing in their ears long after they had left the plantation grounds. A few described visions, dreams of water, of chains breaking, of fire in the dark. They did not share these openly. To admit them was to invite ridicule. But in their journals, scrawled hastily between the lines of measurements, the truth seeped out. By the end of their visit, the physicians had no answers. Their ledgers were thick with numbers, sketches, and words that faltered into uncertainty. One journal ended mid-sentence, the ink trailing off the page as though the hand that held the pen had been stilled by something unseen. When the men left Hollow Creek, they carried their satchels with them, but they did not carry peace. The sound lingered, as it always had, bound not to paper, but to the three small girls who would not be silenced. Not all who heard the sound recoiled from it. In the quarters, where families huddled together after days of labor, the enslaved children began to whisper of the sisters in the cellar. At first, they spoke of fear, how the humming slipped beneath the floorboards and crawled into their dreams, how it made the night seem alive. But in time, fear gave way to fascination. Some swore that if you closed your eyes, the sound would carry you beyond the plantation, across the river, into places where no overseer could follow. The children began to sneak closer when they could, lingering near the heavy doors of the cellar while pretending to fetch water or sweep the halls. They pressed their ears to the wood, listening for the unearthly harmony inside. And more than once, they claimed the sisters seemed to know they were there. The humming would swell, shifting in pitch, as if acknowledging the presence of small listeners on the other side. A few said they even heard words hidden beneath the tones, syllables too soft to understand, but too deliberate to be accident. One boy, no older than 10, told of a dream that returned to him night after night. In it, he stood at the edge of the cotton fields, the triplets before him, their small hands clasped together. They pointed toward the tree line where the forest grew thick and dark. He followed, and in the dream he always woke just as he reached the river's edge. He confessed this to his mother, who hushed him quickly, for such talk was dangerous. But in the quarters, the tale spread. and soon others claimed to have seen the same vision. The adults warned their children not to linger near the cellar, not to tempt fate, not to risk the master's wrath. But children have always been drawn to mysteries, and the triplets were a mystery no warning could erase. To the young they became figures, both terrifying and sacred. Sisters who had no chains but the ones they were born into. Sisters whose voices held the shape of something bigger than fear. For the enslaved, whispers of hope and rebellion were often crushed before they could take root. But the humming of the triplets spread like seeds in the dark, sprouting in the dreams of those who listened. And though the adults tried to bury such stories, they could not bury the sound itself. It drifted, it lingered, and it grew stronger with each passing night. The master could not abide what he could not control. The humming unsettled his nights, unsettled the physicians, unsettled the overseers who drank heavier with every passing week. And so he ordered silence. The triplets were to be broken as others had been broken, through hunger, through pain, through fear. He believed that if they could be made to suffer enough, the strange harmony that haunted the house would fade into nothing. At first came starvation. Their bowls were withheld for days, their straw bedding stripped away so they lay on bare stone. But when the servants crept down to check on them, the girls did not cry. Their voices did not weaken. Instead, the humming continued, softer perhaps, but steady, as though the absence of food only strengthened whatever bond kept them whole. Then came the lash. The overseer who carried it down returned pale and shaken. He reported that no matter how he struck them, the girls did not scream. They clutched one another's hands, and their voices grew louder, weaving together into a sound that made his arm falter mid-swing. He swore the lantern light dimmed with each lash, flickering until the cellar was near swallowed in dark. When he returned above ground, his hands trembled too violently to hold his drink. The punishments escalated. Isolation was tried, separating the sisters into different corners of the cellar, locking them apart with heavy chains. But even then, the humming persisted. It came from 3 directions at once, each voice carrying the same note, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with their defiance. Those who listened too long claimed their bones shook with it, as if the sound had sunk into the marrow. The master grew furious, the overseers grew afraid. What use was a whip if it did not break? What use was hunger if it did not bend the will? In their silence, in their refusal to wail, the triplets had shown a strength greater than any man's cruelty. And though they were children, locked in a cellar with no freedom and no future promised, they had already committed the one act no enslaved body was meant to commit. They had resisted. And resistance, even whispered in the dark, is more terrifying to a master than any curse. The summer of 1846 brought storms that seemed to split the very heavens. Clouds rolled in heavy and black, lightning carving jagged scars across the night sky. The people of Hollow Creek had seen storms before, but these were different. They arrived without warning, swift and violent, as if conjured from the air itself. And every time the thunder cracked, those who listened closely swore they could hear the triplets' humming rise to meet it. One night, when the storm struck hardest, the sound carried farther than ever before. The cellar seemed to tremble with it, the stones quivering as though something beneath the earth wanted to break free. Servants reported that the lanterns along the halls flickered in rhythm with the humming. Out in the quarters, mothers hushed their children, praying under their breath. Overseers tightened their grips on rifles, but their hands shook as the chorus of voices intertwined with the roar of the stove arm outside. And then came the lightning. A bolt struck so close to the plantation house that the very foundations groaned. Windows rattled, glass splintered, and above it all, the triplets' humming surged into a harmony that no human ear could have arranged. It was as though the thunder and the voices were speaking to each other, echoing one another in some forbidden communion. The master tried to dismiss it as coincidence, but fear had already taken root. He ordered the cellar doors barred tighter, guards posted even during the storm. Yet the men stationed there confessed later that they could not stand their posts for long. The humming, paired with the crack of thunder, grew unbearable. One guard swore the sound crawled into his chest and made his heart stumble out of rhythm. Another claimed the lightning illuminated 3 figures at the window of the cellar, though no window existed. After that night, whispers spread like wildfire. Among the enslaved, some believed the sisters were not cursed but chosen, tied to forces greater than chains, forces that moved with the clouds and storms themselves. Others feared what such power meant, for power that unsettled the masters was dangerous for all. The masters, meanwhile, grew more desperate. The storm had not broken the sisters, nor had the lash, nor had hunger. Their humming only grew louder, more insistent, as though fed by each attempt to silence it. And now, with the heavens answering in fire and thunder, even those who had once scoffed began to wonder if Hollow Creek housed not 3 children, but 3 omens born of wrath itself. While storms raged outside and humming rattled the walls within, there was one soul who carried the heaviest silence of all: their mother. Her body had birthed them, her hands had held them only for moments, and then they were gone, stolen into the cellar of Hollow Creek. Each day she passed the grand house, her chest tightening as she imagined her daughters beneath it, alone in the damp. And yet she was powerless, her pleas dismissed, her tears ignored, her voice crushed under the weight of ownership. Still, she found ways to reach them. When sent to the kitchens, she lingered near the cellar door, pressing her palm against the wood as if her touch might seep through. On the rare nights she was allowed to clean inside, she left behind crumbs of cornbread, scraps of cloth, a whispered prayer in the air that she hoped they could hear. The triplets never answered with words, but more than once, when her hand rested against the door, the humming shifted, deepened, as though they knew their mother stood there. In the quarters, she spoke little of them. To name them aloud was to risk punishment, or worse, to invite someone to repeat her words where the wrong ears might hear. Instead, she carried their names in her heart, whispering them only when she was sure no one else could hear. Sarah, Selah, Serenity, each name a thread, woven into her prayers at night, binding her to them across the cruel distance. Her grief carved her into something smaller, quieter, but it did not erase her. Other mothers in bondage often buried their children with tears, but she lived each day with her daughters still breathing, close enough to touch, yet impossibly far. That grief was a wound that never closed, bleeding silently as the months turned to years. She feared what the masters wanted from them, what the physicians recorded in their ledgers, what punishments they endured in the dark. But in her heart, a strange flicker of hope survived, for she, too, had heard the humming. She had felt it pass through her bones, steady and unbroken. And though it chilled her, though it frightened her with what it might mean, it also whispered that her daughters were still together, still unbroken, still hers. The sound was no longer just a lullaby in the dark. By 1847, those who lived at Hollow Creek began to speak of it as a force, a hymn that wove itself through the air, refusing to be silenced. What had once been soft and almost soothing now carried a sharper edge. It unsettled the masters more with every passing night, even as it drew the enslaved closer, binding them in whispers and dreams they dared not speak aloud. The triplets' humming had grown stronger, layered with tones that seemed impossible for such small voices. When they breathed together, the sound wrapped around itself, rising and falling like waves. Sometimes it built so steadily that listeners swore it pressed against the walls, bending the cellar doors. Other times it dipped into a near silence, so low it was felt in the chest rather than heard. Always it returned, unbroken, a reminder that no punishment had stilled their song. For the masters, it became a torment. Their sleep grew shallow, haunted by that unrelenting vibration in the night. They muttered about witchcraft, about curses carried in the blood of slaves. Their ledgers filled with fewer words, as if business itself was drowned out by the sound beneath their floors. And in that silence of ink, fear pooled. But in the quarters, something different took shape. The enslaved began to treat the humming as a kind of prayer. They said it kept watch over the children who dreamed restless dreams, that it wove itself into the rhythm of work songs and gave them strength to endure. Some claimed they heard freedom hidden inside the notes, a secret message carried in the harmony, though none could say exactly what it meant. To those whose lives were bound in chains, the sound became both comfort and warning, a hymn of survival when nothing else was left. It was more than noise. It was resistance, a refusal to break, a refusal to surrender, even in a cellar meant to erase them. And though the sisters remained locked away, their voices reached farther than any chain could hold, touching hearts that beat with despair and reminding them that silence was not the only fate awaiting them. And so the humming endured, carrying through nights thick with heat, through storms that rattled the walls, through punishments that failed to leave scars. Each note was a defiance, and each defiance was a reminder. The triplets had not yielded, and until they did, Hollow Creek itself would never know peace. The physicians who once came with confidence returned with trembling hands. Their journals, once filled with precise measurements and bold claims, grew hesitant. The ink changed from sharp lines to hurried strokes, as though the men no longer trusted the words they wrote. Pages that began with diagrams of bones or notes on the symmetry of features ended in half-finished sentences, ink bleeding into silence. One entry, dated the spring of 1847, began with the words, "The girls do not," and then stopped entirely, the pen stroke dragging across the margin as if yanked from the page. Another journal contained lines scratched so violently that the paper tore. The sound does not cease. It follows. A final fragment, found later in a trunk abandoned at the edge of the plantation, read simply, "They resist." The master grew furious at their lack of clarity, accusing them of cowardice, of superstition, of allowing the whispers of the quarters to poison their judgment. But even he could not ignore that the records were changing. Where once the physicians had written of specimens and anomalies, now they used words like unsettling, unnatural, and inexplicable. Science had given way to fear. Then, without warning, the physicians stopped coming. No explanation was offered, no letters sent. The master raged that his investment in knowledge had been wasted, but in truth the men had fled. Some said they left in the night, taking only what they could carry. Others whispered they had been driven mad by what they heard, unable to endure nights filled with humming that crawled into their very dreams. What they left behind was chaos. Their journals, once so meticulous, vanished from the master's study. Some claimed he burned them in anger, unwilling to let the outside world see his failure. Others believed the sisters themselves had a hand in it, that the pages were taken not by fire, but by something less explainable. What is known is this: the ledgers stopped. The trail of ink, once steady and confident, ended in fragments and silence. And with their disappearance, the sisters slipped further into myth. Their lives, their voices, their resistance, no longer captured in neat handwriting, but left to linger in the air, whispered from mouth to mouth. The official record fell quiet, but the humming never did. Of all the men who worked Hollow Creek, none was more feared than the overseer named Harlan Price. His whip had cut deeper than any lash of storm, and his cruelty was spoken of in low tones by those who dreaded his steps. He prided himself on breaking the strongest men and silencing the bravest women. To him, resistance was weakness waiting to be crushed. And so, when others shrank from the cellar, it was Harlan who volunteered to descend. He swore that he would quiet the sisters, once and for all. He went down with his whip coiled at his side and a lantern in his fist. Those who lingered at the stairway said the humming stopped the moment he entered, as though the sisters had been waiting for him. Silence filled the cellar, thick and heavy. Then, slowly, the sound returned. Not soft this time, not steady, but rising sharp and sudden, 3 tones so perfectly braided that they cut through the air like a blade. Witnesses said Harlan staggered. His lantern shook, the light dancing across the stone walls. He bellowed threats, swung the whip, demanded their silence. But the more he shouted, the louder the humming grew, rising with a rhythm that seemed to press against his chest. His words faltered. His strikes slowed. And then, impossibly, he dropped the whip. When he emerged from the cellar, his face was pale as bone. His eyes darted wildly. His hands shook as if seized by fever. For the first time in memory, Harlan Price did not speak. He sat outside in the dirt, rocking back and forth, the whip lying forgotten at his feet. That night his voice returned, but only in whispers. Frantic, broken words about 3 sets of eyes glowing in the dark, about voices that crawled inside his skull. Within days, Harlan vanished. Some claimed he fled the plantation, running into the woods and never returning. Others swore he was taken by the sisters themselves, swallowed into the cellar's shadows. No grave was ever dug, no body ever found. After his disappearance, the other overseers grew cautious, refusing to linger near the cellar, even in daylight. Whips cracked less often in the fields. Fear hung heavier than the summer heat, spreading like sickness through those who once believed themselves untouchable. The sisters had not raised a hand, not spoken a word, and yet they had broken the cruelest man at Hollow Creek. After Harlan Price vanished, Hollow Creek changed. The master spoke of it rarely, as though silence might erase the shame of losing his strongest arm of control. The other overseers, once loud with threats and cruel laughter, grew quieter in their duties. Whips still cracked in the fields, but not as often, not with the same confidence. It was as though the triplets' humming had seeped into every corner of the plantation, dulling even the bravest cruelty. The ledgers from that year are strange to read. Where once each line detailed rations, punishments, crop yields and sales, the pages grew sparse. Some weeks bore no entries at all. The handwriting faltered, ink blotched and uneven. It is as though the very act of recording became a burden, as though the truth of Hollow Creek could not be written down without the humming bleeding through. Those who lived in the quarters remembered that year differently. They recalled nights of uneasy silence. The humming never vanished, but it changed. It grew lower, stretched longer, until it was less like a song and more like the deep drone of something buried in the earth. It pulsed beneath their feet, a vibration that slipped into their bones. Children complained of restless dreams. Women spoke of feeling watched, though no eyes were upon them. Men lay awake, their ears straining for the sound they both dreaded and longed for. Even the master's household was unsettled. Servants reported that doors creaked open without cause, candles sputtered in rooms where no draught stirred. One claimed to see the reflection of 3 small figures in a hallway mirror, though no children stood behind her. Fear took root in every shadow, yet no one dared confront the cellar again. It was as though Hollow Creek held its breath, waiting for something to break. The triplets themselves were rarely seen, though the sound of them was never absent. No one spoke of them openly. Their mother's lips pressed tighter, her eyes hollowed with grief. Still, she carried her secret names for them, praying that silence did not mean loss. For a year, the plantation seemed suspended between 2 worlds, one that tried to continue as it always had, and another that listened too closely to the voices that refused to be silenced. And then, in the summer of 1848, that fragile silence shattered. It began quietly, as most Bangs at Hollow Creek did. A whisper passed from child to child, from mother to son. They said the triplets' voices had changed again, that the humming no longer belonged only to the cellar. It reached farther now, weaving itself through the night air, curling into the quarters like smoke. And one evening, when the moon hung low and pale, the enslaved gathered without command, drawn as if by an unseen hand. They clustered near the edge of the fields, at the line where tilled earth gave way to the dark of the woods. No one had called them, no one dared speak aloud. Yet they came, dozens of them, families clutching children close, men standing with arms folded tight across their chests. They stood in silence, listening. And from beneath the ground, from the stone belly of the master's house, the sound rose. It was not a lullaby this time. It was not the soft hum of comfort. It was stronger, layered, almost choral, as though more than 3 voices sang. The tones wrapped around each other, echoing outward until the air seemed heavy with it. Some fell to their knees, tears slipping down their cheeks. Others gripped one another's hands, hearts hammering, eyes fixed on the house that loomed in the distance. Children swore they heard words hidden inside the sound, names and places they had never known, rivers and roads that stretched beyond the horizon. Women said they felt warmth, like arms wrapping around them. Men felt something harder to name. Not freedom exactly, but the promise of it, sharp and frightening in its nearness. In the quarters, elders whispered that it was a call. Not to flee blindly, not to rise in revolt, but to remember that even in bondage, voices could not be owned. That night, the enslaved felt less alone, though chains still bound their wrists and ankles. For a brief moment, the humming made them believe there was more to their suffering than silence. When the sound finally faded, the crowd lingered, unwilling to break the spell. They returned to their cabins one by one, carrying with them not answers, but something heavier, the knowledge that they had been summoned, and that the sisters' voices would not stop until something gave way. It was a morning like any other, thick with heat before the sun had fully risen. The house servants carried their trays as they always did, bowls of cold porridge and water meant for the cellar. But when they reached the door at the bottom of the stairs, something was different. The air felt wrong, too still, too heavy. One servant whispered that she smelled smoke, though no fire burned. Another swore she heard the echo of voices fading, as though the sisters had only just stopped humming. When they pushed the door open, the cellar lay in silence. The straw beds were untouched, bowls from the night before sat half full, water cups brimming as if never touched. The chains fixed to the walls hung empty, iron cuffs swinging gently as though stirred by some unseen hand. And of the triplets, there was no sign. Panic spread quickly through the house. The master stormed down the stairs himself, demanding answers, his boots striking against the stone. He searched every corner, shouted their names, though he had never truly given them any. The overseers joined him, torches raised, eyes wild, but the girls were gone. No tunnel led outward, no door stood open, no lock was broken. They had simply vanished. The plantation erupted in chaos. Some, why, spared that the sisters had slipped their chains and fled into the woods, though no tracks were found. Others swore they had seen a glow in the cellar the night before, a light that pulsed in rhythm with the storm overhead. The enslaved bowed their heads, some weeping in fear, others whispering prayers of thanks. For them, it was not escape that mattered, but the fact that the masters could no longer claim ownership of the sisters. The master refused to accept it. He accused servants of helping them, ordered whippings, tore through the quarters demanding confessions. But no one spoke, and no one could. There were no secrets to tell, because no one knew how it had happened. The girls had been there one night, and by dawn, they were gone. And in their absence, the silence was unbearable. For the first time in years, the cellar held no humming. Yet those who stood near swore the stones themselves vibrated faintly, as if the sound had sunk into the walls. It was not escape that terrified the masters most. It was the possibility that the sisters had not left at all, that they had become something the cellar could no longer contain. The night after the cellar was found empty, Hollow Creek did not sleep. The master raged through the halls, demanding answers no one could give. Overseers patrolled the fields with lanterns and dogs, their shouts tearing through the dark, though no scent was ever caught, no tracks ever found. The enslaved lay awake in their cabins, whispering prayers, afraid to speak the truth aloud. The sisters were gone, and no one knew where. Then, just before dawn, the fire came. It began in the lower rooms of the house, though no one agreed on where. Some claimed it started in the cellar itself, a sudden burst of flame that climbed the walls as though the stone had been soaked in oil. Others swore it was sparked in the master's study, where the journals of the physicians had been stored. Wherever it began, the fire moved fast, feeding on wood that had stood for decades. Servants rushed to fetch water, overseers shouted orders, but the blaze seemed to resist every effort. Flames leapt from beam to beam, swallowing the lower house in a glow that lit the night sky. Witnesses said the sound of the triplets' humming returned with it, rising from the crackle of burning timber, carrying through the smoke like a chorus hidden inside the fire itself. Some heard it as mourning, others as triumph, but all who heard it swore it was there. By the time the sun rose, half the house was blackened ruin. The master raged louder than ever, blaming everyone and no one, his fury masking the fear in his eyes. He insisted the fire had been an accident, a lantern overturned, carelessness by the servants. But in the quarters, no one believed it. To them, it was no accident. It was the fire that followed the sisters, the fire that erased what chains and punishments could not. No bodies were found in the ashes. No trace of the triplets lay among the ruins. Only charred beams, scorched stone, and a silence thicker than smoke. The official record, when written later, listed nothing but property damage. But the whispers carried another truth. The girls had not been destroyed. They had been claimed by something greater, leaving Hollow Creek with nothing but fire to explain the unexplainable. And after the flames, the humming did not return. Yet those who had heard it said the silence was worse. When the ashes cooled and the cellar stood empty, Hollow Creek should have been left with only silence. Yet silence did not satisfy. Whispers began to spread, whispers that gave shape to what the fire had tried to erase. Some said the sisters had perished in the flames, their bodies consumed without trace. But those who had stood outside the night of the fire swore otherwise. They claimed the humming had grown louder as the flames rose higher, not fading but rising, steady and unbroken. A field hand named Jonah insisted he had seen 3 small figures walk calmly through the smoke, their hands clasped, their faces turned toward the woods beyond the fields. "Not running," he said, his voice hushed years later. "Not fleeing. Walking. Like they knew the path." Others added to the tale. A kitchen maid swore she found footprints in the morning dew leading from the edge of the house to the tree line. 3 sets, side by side, small but sure. A boy who had climbed the barn roof for a better view claimed he heard their voices long after the fire had died, humming from deep within the forest. When he tried to follow, his mother yanked him back, warning him never to speak of it again. The masters dismissed these stories as nonsense, fabrications of frightened minds. They demanded silence from the quarters, forbidding talk of the triplets under threat of the lash. But even they could not hide the unease in their eyes. If the sisters had burned, then the matter was ended. But if they had walked free, if they had stepped beyond the plantation into the dark, then what force had opened their chains? And what would become of them now? Among the enslaved, the whispers took on a different shape. Some said the sisters had crossed the river and vanished into free soil. Others claimed they had not left this world at all, but passed into another, carried by their song. A few believed they lingered in the woods, watching, waiting, their humming carried on the wind. And so the image endured. 3 black sisters, hand in hand, walking into the darkness without fear, leaving behind a house in ruins and a silence that no one could explain. Whether flesh or spirit, living or gone, they had done the one thing no master believed possible. They had left Hollow Creek on their own terms. After the fire and the whispers of their vanishing, the masters of Hollow Creek did what those in power always did when faced with something they could not explain. They turned to ink. The ledgers, once filled with the neat columns of cotton yields, lists of rations, and accounts of births and deaths, became suddenly clean of anything to do with the triplets. Their names, if they had ever been written, disappeared. Their mother's entry in the household book listed only that she had delivered 1 child, deceased. No mention of 3. No mention of voices. No mention of fire. It was as though the sisters had never existed at all. When outside traders visited and asked about the smoke that had scarred the house, the master claimed it was a kitchen fire, swiftly contained. If pressed, he grew hostile, waving off questions with sharp denials. The overseers echoed his lies, though their eyes darted when the subject was raised. To outsiders, Hollow Creek was unchanged. But those within its bounds knew better. They knew what had been seen. They knew what had been heard. The physicians' journals, too, were gone. The chest that once held them sat empty, its wood scorched as though it had been dragged too close to the flames. Some whisper, Ed, that the master himself had burned them to ash, fearing that their contents might leak beyond the plantation walls. Others claimed the sisters had taken them, their voices seeping into the pages and carrying them away into whatever darkness they had walked. Whatever the truth, not a single page survived. This deliberate silence unsettled the enslaved most of all. To them, erasure was nothing new. Names stripped from ledgers, lives reduced to lines of property and profit. But the triplets had been different. They had not only existed, they had resisted. And to see even their memory snuffed out on paper was a cruelty sharper than chains. Mothers whispered their names in secret. Fathers carved 3 small marks into cabin doors. Children hummed softly under their breath when they thought no one was listening. The masters believed that silence on the page meant silence in the world. But the enslaved knew better. Ink could be erased, journals could be burned, ledgers could be rewritten. Yet memory lived in breath and bone. And no matter what the records claimed, everyone at Hollow Creek remembered the sisters. And sometimes, on the stillest nights, they swore the silence itself seemed to hum. Though the ledgers went silent and the journals turned to ash, the sound of the triplets did not vanish. It lived on in memory, carried from mouth to mouth, soft enough to escape the ears of masters, but strong enough to endure through generations. In the quarters, mothers rocked their infants with low hums that echoed the sisters' tones, fragments of melody stitched into lullabies. They would never admit where the sound came from, not aloud, but those who listened closely could hear the rhythm of Hollow Creek's cellar in every note. Children sang it when they played, 3 notes rising together, sometimes without knowing why. The elders hushed them quickly, fearful of punishment, but could not stop the tune from slipping out again. It became part of the air, woven into the fabric of nights, heavy with labor and grief. To some it was comfort, a reminder that resistance had once been real, that 3 young girls had refused to break. To others, it was warning, proof that the unexplainable still lingered, that power could slip through chains like water through fingers. As years passed, the sound stretched beyond Hollow Creek. Those sold to other plantations carried it with them, humming softly under their breath, while bent over fields miles away. Some claimed the tune changed as it traveled, merging with work songs, blending with spirituals, until it was no longer a single melody, but part of a larger chorus. Yet at its heart, the same three tones endured, tied together like the sisters' clasped hands. Even those who had been children during the time of the triplets carried the memory into old age. They told their grandchildren that on nights of storm, when thunder split the sky, they still heard it faintly. They described it not as singing, not even as human, but as something between, a sound that filled the air without ever leaving the lips. And when the young asked Waupuis what it meant, the elders only shook their heads. Some truths were too heavy for children to carry. The masters believed they had erased the triplets from history, but they had forgotten one thing. Memory does not live on paper alone. Memory breathes, it hums, it waits. And as long as the songs were whispered in the dark, the sisters were not gone. Years after the cellar fell silent, a fragment surfaced far from Hollow Creek. It was found folded inside an old volume of medical notes in a Charleston apothecary, its edges singed, its ink blurred by water or sweat. The handwriting belonged to one of the physicians who had visited the plantation in 1847. Most of the words had bled into illegibility, but the lines that remained were enough to set hearts pounding for those who dared to read them. The subjects persist beyond all expectation. Their voices do not fade with time or distance. The sound alters the air. I fear it alters me. This is not a matter of science. This is something else. They do not die. That last sentence, they do not die, was underlined twice, the ink so heavy it nearly tore through the page. The letter ended there, abruptly, with no signature, no date. Nothing followed to explain what the physician had meant, or whether he ever returned to Hollow Creek again. The scrap passed quietly from hand to hand. Some dismissed it as the ravings of a man broken by superstition. Others treated it like evidence, proof that the sisters had not simply vanished, but had become something uncontainable. Among the enslaved, those words were retold in whispers. They do not die. To people whose families were torn apart by the lash and the auction block, the possibility of survival beyond chains, beyond flesh, carried a dangerous kind of hope. The master, if he ever learned of the letter's existence, never acknowledged it. His silence was louder than denial, a silence that grew heavier as the years wore on. The cellar remained locked, even after the fire had gutted its walls, as though he feared the sisters might one day return to reclaim it. But the enslaved remembered. They carried the letter's words in secret prayers, repeated them under their breath when the nights felt longest. They do not die. It became a promise, a warning, and a curse all at once. And so the triplets' story, once nearly buried by ash and silence, clawed its way back through a scrap of paper no wider than a hand. Not enough to explain, not enough to resolve, but enough to keep the fear alive. Enough to remind everyone that the sisters' absence was not the end. It was only the beginning of something no one could name. The masters tried to bury the triplets twice, once in chains and once in silence. But the truth of Hollow Creek had already escaped the cellar, and once loose, it could not be contained. The story of the sisters passed from mouth to mouth, never spoken loudly, always guarded like contraband. It lived in fragments, in half-remembered details, in whispers around fire pits after long days in the fields. And because it was forbidden, it became all the more powerful. Children grew up hearing that 3 girls had once walked through fire without fear. They were we. Arned not to repeat such things where overseers might listen, but warnings could not erase wonder. When storms rolled over the sky, the children pressed close to their mothers and whispered that the triplets were near, humming along with the thunder. Among the elders, the story carried weight more than hope. They had seen what had been done to those who resisted, how rebellion was met with blood and ruin. To them, the sisters were both miracle and danger. Speaking of them might give strength, but it might also bring suspicion. And suspicion was enough to doom a whole family. And so the tale was told in shadows, where only trusted ears could hear. Still it spread. To other plantations, to travelers who carried it folded inside their songs, to those who whispered in prayer meetings that trembled with both faith and fear. Some told it as a story of spirits, that the sisters had died in the fire and returned as voices, haunting Hollow Creek until judgment. Others said they had fled north, carried by their own song across rivers and forests to lands where chains could not follow. Every retelling shifted, but the core never changed. The sisters had been born, they had resisted, and they had vanished in a way no master could explain. That truth alone was enough to make the story forbidden. Because in a world built on chains, the idea of children who could not be broken, who walked out together hand in hand, was more dangerous than any weapon. The masters were right to fear it. They could destroy journals, burn ledgers, lock doors, and silence tongues with the lash. But they could not stop memory from humming in the dark. The forbidden story lived, and the more they tried to erase it, the stronger it seemed to grow. Time moved on, and Hollow Creek's fields changed hands. Slavery ended, the war tore through the South, and the old plantation house fell into ruin. But though chains were broken, the memory of the triplets did not fade. It clung to the place like smoke that never cleared. And for those who came after, overseers' sons, masters' descendants, even strangers who later tried to live on the land, the fear lingered. Stories from those years are scattered, but they share unsettling echoes. Families who inherited the property spoke of sleepless nights in rooms where nothing stirred. They complained of humming that rose through the floors, faint at first, then louder, until candles trembled in their holders. One woman swore she heard it while nursing her newborn, the low harmony making her child's tiny chest rise and fall in rhythm with it. Another confessed in a letter that her husband left the property altogether, convinced the voices were driving him mad. Children who played in the fields whispered of seeing 3 figures at dusk, small and distant, walking hand in hand at the tree line. When they ran closer, the figures melted into the shadows, leaving only silence behind. A farmhand claimed he found 3 sets of footprints in the mud near the river, side by side, though no one had been seen crossing. He quit that same week, muttering that he would not work land where the dead still walked. Even in the years when no one lived at Hollow Creek, travelers avoided it. They said the air grew heavy as you passed, that you could feel a vibration underfoot, like a song too low to hear. Some crossed themselves. Others hurried their horses, but few lingered long. The ruin of the house stood as a warning, its cellar blackened stone, the only part still whole. Among the descendants of the enslaved, the whispers took a different shape. For them, the triplets were not ghosts to be feared, but voices to be remembered. Yet even they admitted that the sound unsettled them, because whether spirit or memory, miracle or curse, the sisters had never stopped humming. And so the fear endured. Not the kind that whips or chains inspire, but something older, heavier. A reminder that Hollow Creek had birthed a story that refused to die, a story that made even the bravest pause when the night grew too still. The years turned the Hollow Creek triplets into more than a memory. They became a riddle no one could answer. Were they children who defied the lash and slipped away into freedom? Were they spirits, burned in the fire and bound forever to the land that tried to own them? Or were they something else entirely, a force born of grief and suffering, given form in 3 small bodies that could not be controlled? Those who sought reason offered their theories. Some said they had been smuggled away by sympathetic servants, spirited north under cover of darkness. Others claimed they drowned in the river while fleeing, their bodies swallowed by the current, leaving only their legend behind. A few physicians, reluctant to let go of their need for answers, suggested they had perished in the cellar, their bones hidden to protect the master's pride. But none of these explanations accounted for the voices still heard long after the house lay in ruins. The enslaved and their descendants carried different truths. To them, the sisters were a sign of endurance, proof that resistance could live even in children. Their humming was not death, but survival. A message carried through storms, through fire, through silence. In their telling, the triplets had walked into the woods not to vanish, but to become part of something larger. The land itself had taken them in, their song woven into the rivers and trees, into the storms that split the sky. And then there were those who believed something darker. They whispered that the sisters had not escaped at all, but had changed, transformed by the cruelty inflicted upon them. Their song, they said, was not merely defiance but hunger, a call that drew the living toward the cellar where they had once been caged. To linger too long in those ruins was to invite madness, to feel their voices slip under your skin until you were never the same. No proof ever surfaced. No grave was found, no body exhumed, no ledger uncovered to settle the matter. The truth was lost in the fire, in silence, in the lies of those who tried to bury it. And perhaps that was what made the story endure. Because without an ending, the Hollow Creek triplets remained unfinished. And unfinished stories never stop asking to be told. The Hollow Creek triplets were not the only ones lost to silence. Across the South, thousands of lives were erased, not by fire or storm, but by ink withheld, by ledgers that reduced people to property, by Bibles where names were never written. Families torn apart at auctions left no trace but memory. Children buried in unmarked ground were forgotten by everyone but the mothers who carried their absence in their bones. What was not recorded was easier to deny, and denial was the master's truest weapon. That is what made the story of the triplets so dangerous. Their existence had slipped through the cracks of erasure. Despite the ledgers being scrubbed, despite the physicians' journals vanishing, despite the silence the masters demanded, the sisters endured in whispers. They refused to be smothered by ink or lack of it. Their humming lived where no hand could blot it out, in air, in memory, in the marrow of those who listened. This is why their tale lingers even now. Because it is not only their story, but the story of countless others who were silenced before they could be remembered. Every enslaved voice lost to ash, every song cut short by the lash, every prayer whispered into the earth. All of them live in the shadow of erasure. And in that shadow, the triplets shine brighter. They are proof that not every attempt to bury a life succeeds. But survival in memory is not the same as peace. Their story is not tidy, not complete. It is jagged, burned at the edges, filled with gaps that no historian can fill. Perhaps that is why it haunts. Because what is missing demands more attention than what is known. Were they flesh and blood who walked into freedom? Spirits who hummed themselves beyond death? Or were they simply three little girls whose suffering was too great for paper to hold? We cannot know. And perhaps we are not meant to. What we do know is this: the masters erased their names. But names are not the only way to be remembered. A sound can endure longer than ink. A song can outlive silence. And so long as the humming is recalled, in story or dream, the sisters remain. Nearly a century and a half has passed since the fire, since the cellar fell silent, since 3 small girls were last seen hand in hand. Yet the case of the Hollow Creek triplets has never been closed. How could it be? There were no bodies, no graves, no names in ledgers to anchor them to history. Only fragments remain. A scorched letter, a handful of memories, and the whispers of those who swore they saw them walk into the woods as the flames devoured the master's house. What happened to them after that night remains the great unanswerable question. If they were flesh, They left no trace in the world of men. No census, no marriage records, no births to carry their line. If they were spirit, they lingered too vividly to be dismissed as superstition. Their humming was heard for years after, unsettling masters, comforting the enslaved, embedding itself in songs that stretched beyond Hollow Creek. And if they were something else entirely, neither flesh nor spirit, but something unbound, then perhaps we were never meant to know their ending. The masters called it unholy, a curse that unsettled their prophets and poisoned their sleep. The physicians called it inexplicable, their notes failing them where ink had once been their weapon. The enslaved called it something else, though never aloud, a hymn of resistance, a reminder that even in bondage, something unbroken could still exist. And that is why this story endures, because it is more than a tale of three sisters. It is the record of a silence that failed, of an erasure that did not hold, of a history too jagged to be forgotten. The Hollow Creek triplets remain unsolved foes, bidden, unholy. A case the masters could not control, a story history could not destroy. Even now, when the ruins of the plantation lie hidden beneath weeds and trees, those who pass through say the ground vibrates faintly beneath their feet, as if something hums beneath the soil. Some dismiss it as imagination. Others turn quickly away. But the few who pause and listen swear the sound is there, soft and steady, unbroken after all these years. The case is not closed. Perhaps it never can be. Long after Hollow Creek crumbled into ruin, the sisters remained, not in flesh, not in ink, but in the uneasy space between memory and silence. Their story lived on like an open wound, a scar that never healed, because it was never allowed to close. For every enslaved mother who lost her child, the triplets became a reminder that not every life could be stolen so easily. For every descendant who searched for names in ledgers and found nothing but blank lines, their humming became proof that absence does not mean forgetting. The memory of the sisters haunts because it is unfinished. We do not know where they went, whether their small feet carried them beyond the river, or whether their voices simply dissolved into air. We do not know if they lived long enough to grow old, or if they became something that never aged at all. What we know is that their presence was too large for the chains that tried to bind them, and their silence after was too heavy for the masters to explain. And so the memory hums on. It hums in stories passed through generations, whispered like secrets but held like prayers. It hums in the lullabies sung to restless children, in the storms that rattle the sky, in the ruins of the cellar where some swear the stones still vibrate if you press your ear against them. It hums because the sisters' refusal to break became larger than their disappearance. This is why their case unsettles more than it comforts. It is not the story of freedom won, nor of justice served. It is the story of something unexplainable slipping through the cracks of history, resisting the erasure that swallowed so many others. It is the story of a haunting that does not fade, of a memory that lingers because it must. Some say haunting belongs to ghosts, but the truth is simpler. We are haunted not by the dead, but by the unfinished. The Hollow Creek triplets were never given an ending. They were taken, they resisted, they vanished. And that is where the record ends. But memory does not end so neatly. It circles, it returns, it asks again and again, where did they go, and why can we still hear them? Until those questions are answered, and perhaps they never will be, the sisters will continue to hum in the dark, a memory too heavy to silence, a haunting too powerful to forget. And so, the case of the Hollow Creek triplets remains what it has always been: unholy, unfinished, unforgettable. Three sisters born in chains, who hummed through hunger, who defied the lash, who stood unbroken in the face of every attempt to silence them. They were children, yet they became something larger than children. They became the fear of masters, the hope of the enslaved, the mystery of generations. No ledger holds their names. No stone marks their resting place. No history book records their fate. And perhaps that is why they endure. Because absence has a weight all it is own, heavier than fact, sharper than truth. What we do not know demands more of us than what we do. Even now the ruins of Hollow Creek stand buried beneath weeds and shadows, the cellar's stone walls blackened, but still unbroken. Travelers who pass by sometimes stop, though few dare linger long. They say the air grows thick near the foundations, the silence pressing against their ears. Some swear they feel the faintest vibration beneath their feet, steady and low, like a song pulsing in the earth. They listen, and for a moment they believe the sisters are still there, waiting, watching, humming. Maybe it is memory. Maybe it is haunting. Maybe it is the truth that no one was brave enough to write down. But whatever it is, it has survived. And in surviving, the triplets have outlived the masters who sought to erase them. Their story is not just history. It is a warning. It is a prayer. It is a hymn of resistance that carries across time, reminding us that silence cannot hold what was never meant to be silent. If you have walked with me through this darkness, you know the weight of forbidden stories. Subscribe to the Macabre Record, so you do not miss the ones still waiting in shadow. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Every voice, every place, becomes part of remembering what history tried to erase. The Hollow Creek triplets were never meant to be remembered, yet here we are, remembering them still.